Greetings. Welcome to ITR Live. I'm your host, Chris Hagan, and welcome back for another fun-filled, action-packed episode of Iowa's premier conservative podcast. Yes, I didn't even get to the opening line, and John is laughing. This is fantastic. So we're on a roll.
Nice.
We have a special guest today on the podcast. We have Vance Ginn with us today. And John, Vance, welcome.
Hey, thanks. It's a pleasure with you today.
Good. John wrote me a big bio of you, which is long, and all of your distinguished roles that you've done. So I feel like a lot of our listeners, no offense, Vance, but I think most of them probably aren't familiar with you yet, unless they read all of John's work on itrfoundation.org. So I'm going to read the whole bio, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, good. Well, Vance, first of all, is a contributing scholar to ITR Foundation and has done work with us. And John, I know you have worked with Vance for quite a while. But Vance is the founder and president of Ginn Economic Consulting and host of his Let People Prosper Show podcast, which we got to get on, John.
Yes.
Have you been on it?
I have. Yeah,
okay, good.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah.
Well, if you've been on it, then I feel satisfied. But okay. Dr. Ginn is Chief Economist of the Pelican Institute for Public Policy, Senior Fellow of Americans for Tax Reform, and contributes to other think tanks around the country, including ITR Foundation. So good. Dr. Ginn previously served, and this is what interesting, and I would like to ask you a little bit about this, Vance, but previously served as the Associate Director for Economic Policy of the White House's Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, from June 2019 to May 2020, and was Chief Economist of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. So anyway, did I get it right? Did I miss anything?
No, I think those are all good. I'm also the Chief Economist of the Pelican Institute in Louisiana, so keeping busy, that's for sure, trying to fight to let people prosper.
Good. Any number of those things are far more impressive than anything John and I are doing on a day-to-day basis around here, so we're honored. Anyway, so
did John laugh again? I hope he laughed again.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
No, it's great. We love it. So what I want to get to eventually today, Vance, is this article that you and John wrote on a conservative Iowa budget, and I think it's a really kind of a deeper dive into how things should work, how things are working. But I guess in the interest of letting people get to know you a little better, I'd like to hear a little bit more about specifically what you did at OMB during the Trump administration, and I guess later on more what you're doing specifically around state level think tanks around the country.
Yeah, well, it was a great time there, but also an extraordinary, interesting, and a quick time that I was there for about a year in the Trump administration at the Office of Management and Budget, and someone who went to homeschool, grew up low income in Houston, Texas, first generation college student, and all of those things, to find myself in the White House was pretty remarkable, and just a great experience overall. And so I worked directly under Russ Vought. He was the acting director of OMB at that time. And I helped write the president's last budget, where we found $4.6 trillion in savings over a decade. Still wouldn't have balanced the budget just yet, but at least it was heading us in a good direction, or a better direction than especially we are now at the federal level. And it also gave me a lot of insights about what's up with the budget, at the federal level, how it's really driven by Social Security, Medicare, those costs. One of the things that we were working a lot on was trying to rein in the what's called discretionary spending, basically everything else except Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. How do we get those costs under control first? Because the argument was from Russ Vought and even President Trump was that if we can't get our own federal government house in order, how can we go out and ask senior citizens and the poor to take a hit first? And so that was a big push there to find those savings, and we did a pretty good job of that. And then, but then soon thereafter is when COVID hit. And then I found myself in a situation room multiple times, talking with the economic team of Larry Kudlow and Kevin Hassett and Tomas Phillipson and others from CEA, Council of Economic Advisors, and the National Economic Council and things of that nature, talking about how this is going to influence the economy. And of course, we knew that it was going to hurt. This was not going to be a good situation. People had already started, even before all the shutdowns and everything else, people had already started, staying home more because they were getting ill. They had COVID. And so we knew it was going to take a huge hit. And I was one of the ones really trying to fight back, saying, look, we don't need to shut anything down. Let's let entrepreneurs work this out and go and find a path forward. Because if not, many people's livelihoods are going to be crushed, which is also going to contribute to a lot of the cost down the road. And that didn't quite pan out the way that I would have liked to, as everything did shut down for a while. But it taught me a lot of good lessons about being inside government. That was my first time to ever have worked in government. I worked in academia for a while at Texas Tech University and Sam Houston State University. And then I had been at the Texas Public Policy Foundation for nearly a decade at that point. And it was really interesting and thought-provoking and good lessons to have learned while being in there and having all of those discussions and debates. And so I really took a lot out of it during my year.
Yeah. That's fascinating. I bet we could probably pick your brain just on that for as much time as we have today. I guess I'm curious, because you've been on the inside at the federal level and done the work that you have at the state level. Like, compare and contrast that for me. I mean, I think our listeners here kind of instinctively know that things work a little bit better at the state level, but just the approach to budgeting and can you give me a little bit of color on the differences between those two?
Yeah, and I think it's an important distinction to have, because states are really where the action is. It's one of the reasons why I've done so much work at the state level compared to federal level, because not a lot gets done. It takes an act of Congress. They're not working together to get things done, and so it makes it very difficult. It is interesting, though, with the states have a balanced budget. Almost 49, that's almost all, 49 to 50 states, excluding Vermont, have a balanced budget to where amendment or some form of a balanced budget to where their revenue has to equal their spending at the end of the day. And the federal government, as we know, does not have that.
Yeah.
That's why they're racking up all these massive deficits. We've got $34 trillion in national debt. We're paying $1 trillion just on net interest payments on the debt and rolling that over. So we're essentially insolvent at the federal level. And the federal government also has, this public-private entity called the Federal Reserve, a central bank that can print money that states don't have. And so they have to be more fiscally, not necessarily conservative, because a lot of them spend too much over time, but they at least have to have some sort of sustainable, responsible budgeting, because they've got to keep their revenue equal to their expenditures at the end of the day. So that's a huge difference of a mentality of what a government is going to do with each one of those dollars, because at the end of the day, right, the ultimate burden of government is how much they spend. It's not how much they tax or how much they regulate, it's how much they spend, because if they didn't spend it, they don't have to tax it. And they couldn't regulate it if they don't spend it on the bureaucrats within the agencies that they have. And so you've really got to go after spending, which is what we'll talk about, the conservative Iowa budget and some other things. But being in the White House, in the executive branch, was different too, because then you're looking at regulations with executive orders. You're looking at how the distribution of the funds are at OMB whenever Congress passes a law. OMB is really where they're the ones that distribute the money out to all the agencies. And so that was something to really learn about and be interested in. And it made it to where there was more action, rightly or wrongly. I think sometimes we get into this idea that, well, Congress isn't going to act, so let's put all these executive orders out, which can work well whenever it's a limited government sort of approach. But then when you have, like, the Biden administration came in, they use it to the extent in the other direction with very large regulations and other things that are impediments to economic growth in the economy, which has not been a good situation. And so I think when you look at the states where action can happen, where they're making pro-growth policies, you can and here's another big thing, though, is that people can move with their feet.
Yeah.
And they do that. And that's why we're seeing people fleeing, really, California, New York, Illinois, and moving to places like Texas, where I live, or Florida and Iowa. I mean, these are the types of things that we need to see because of good policy reforms, whereas at the federal level, it's across the entire country, one-size-fits-all policies, and those often fit no one or very few. Right. And so I think that's why we need differences there with our system of federalism.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's You covered a lot there, and I think that's something that John and I agree with very much. So, John, you wanted to jump in on this. I haven't let you get a word in here.
No, that's all right. That's a great question. I think it gives us a good transition, Vance, to talk about the conservative Iowa budget. And I liked what you said. The burden of government is how much sort of drives the budget drives that in terms of even taxes and spending. But before we get into the conservative Iowa budget, I just want to let everyone know that you've been working with not just Iowa, but a variety of states on sort of this project that you started when you were at Texas Public Policy Foundation of just trying to promote better budgeting and conservative budgeting. And so could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure, John. So I started this when I was working at the Texas Public Policy Foundation for Texas. We called it the Conservative Texas Budget back in 2014 because before that, Republicans had a majority in the House and Senate in Texas starting in 2003. But spending was still out of control. As we know, not all Republicans are fiscally conservative, and so it was still going out of control. And there wasn't a strict spending limit. It wasn't very effective. And so we thought as an organization, how can we really message sound budgeting if the legislature is not going to strengthen their spending limit and they're not going to appropriate things appropriately, sustainably, then what else can we do to do that? And so what we did was we just set up a target. We said, okay, here's the budget number. Let's increase it by population growth plus inflation, which is a good measure of the average taxpayer's ability to pay for government spending, because population growth, you have more people. Inflation is typically tied to wage growth over time. So you have wages and you have more people, they can pay for more government spending if it's necessary. And so that's a good measure to use. And also Colorado Taxpayer Bill of Rights was based on that as well. And so this has been a long-standing sort of gold standard of a sound spending limit. And so we put that out there and just said, okay, we're going to put out the number. And we did that. And starting in the next 4 budgets, they passed it below population growth plus inflation. And that was just a good measure to use. And so after I came back from the White House trying to use it there, we did include some of that within the president's last budget with this spending limit approach. I said, you know what, well, we need to take this to other states. And that's when you and I started talking, John, about conservative Iowa budget. And now I'm working with 15 states now, state think tanks across the country, in Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, just a number, Kansas, a number of them, where I'm working on either a conservative budget, depends on what they call it, like call it conservative Iowa budget there, or there's a responsible budget, or there's sustainable budgets, but they're all based on this same sort of structure, format of limiting government spending to no more than population growth plus inflation, and finding ways to say, you know what, here's the maximum number for the appropriators to use. They can have flexibility of where that money is going to go, whether it's healthcare, education, or anything else. But the top line number, once you add up all those different areas of government, should grow no more than this number. And that has been very successful, as we've seen, in Iowa.
Yeah, and I have to say, I think we were one of the earlier ones to work with you on this, because this is our the article that's up there now on looking at fiscal year 2025 is our 3rd edition of the Conservative Iowa budget. So we're pretty excited about that. And one thing I think, Vance, is as you and I have looked into this for the past few years, Iowa has been doing some really good things in terms of fiscal conservatism. And so we've sort of used that metric, population plus inflation, that you outlined. And as we look, kind of just give some background here of what's going on in Iowa, is we know that over the last few years, Iowa has been doing a pretty good job with prudent budgeting, and so we've been running surpluses over the past few years. In fact, fiscal year 2023 surplus was $1.83 billion, and future surpluses are projected. We also have a large taxpayer relief fund that has close to $3 billion in it, and our reserve accounts are full to their statutory maximum. So when we're looking at, for fiscal year 25, last year, the when legislature did a really good job with the budget. I mean, it was only a little over 3% increase, I think, and then and so they passed about an $8.5 billion budget. They only spent a little over 88% of estimated revenues, and Iowa does have a spending limit. It's sort of a weak one, but it is a 99% limit, but
it is a weak one. We've talked about that a little bit in the past.
Yeah.
Iowa's is, yes, it's there, but it obviously they cannot withstand it. And it's 99% of available revenue, not the ongoing revenue, which makes a big difference, especially when you got these big surplus amounts. So, yeah, that's right. To that end, and I'm sorry to jump in on you because, Vance, I wanted to briefly, I know the answer to this. John knows the answer to this, and I hope that most of our listeners at least have a sense of this. One thing that we hear from the left is that the reason that Iowa's budget is so flush with cash and that we're able to do tax reform, and you hear this in other states as well, is because of federal stimulus dollars. And would you just touch on that? Because we've rebutted that argument many times, but I want to hear it from you as well.
Yeah, you do hear that often. In a lot of states, 25 states have been cutting taxes over the last 3 years. And I really believe it's from the work that you all have been doing, that we've been working on together with the conservative Iowa budget, that has provided opportunities to cut the income tax. I mean, this is a path really, I think, ultimately to zero, even what Governor Reynolds has talked about for the personal income tax, which is huge. And it all goes back to sound budgeting. And so the federal government over the last couple of years has sent an extraordinary, historic amount of money to states during the pandemic in a way to help close the gap, or at least their argument was to help close the gap for the revenue losses that were going to happen during that period of time. But that went to a lot of other extraneous expenditures. Some of it went to education. A lot of it went to Medicaid for a lot of the plus-ups that were happening, increases that were above the normal Medicaid reimbursement rates. Because if you had somebody that had a COVID in a hospital, they would get a higher return than if it was just another patient without COVID. And so all of this expenditures that were sent out to the states for a number of reasons did increase the amount of money they had available. But we've got to remember that the tax cuts can't come from, well, they could, but that's not how the states have been doing it. They've been using their general revenue, because general revenue is the amount that they have the most discretion over, and which is one reason why we use it for the conservative Iowa budget. And that's also the revenue that you want to use when you have surpluses to cut taxes with. And that's what states have been doing. It's not the federal funds, because those federal funds are going to dry up. And if you use the federal funds in order to cut taxes, you're going to have what's called a fiscal cliff, meaning that those dollars are going to dry up, and then you're going to have a big amount of expenditures that you're either going to have to cut spending dramatically, or you're going to have to raise taxes. And we learned over time, fortunately, from other examples, like in Kansas, former Governor Sam Brownback and the legislature, they cut taxes during the aughts about a decade ago. And what they didn't do was limit government spending. And so it drove up deficits, and they had this mismatch. And so what they did is they raised taxes. And so all the left came in and said, look, the reason why that y'all had to raise taxes was because you cut taxes too much. And really the problem, though, was that there was too much government spending. And that's what's good to see right now, is that states are getting their fiscal house in order, and they are not overspending, and they're not looking at the federal money to cut taxes with. Instead, they're using good fiscal, sound, prudent budgeting to allow for those tax cuts to happen, which will make them sustainable and not unsustainable had they used the federal dollars.
Yeah, Vance, one other thing I want to get your thoughts on is, of course, as we're coming into the next legislative session here in Iowa, and you kind of outlined that the priority is going to be for probably, we're pretty excited of potential historic income tax cuts that Governor Reynolds is going to lead the charge on. Excuse me, but we also been seeing some people. There's a recent op-ed, for example, that was in the Cedar Rapids paper that said that if Iowa tax cuts are going to lead to a disaster, and it was very much almost like an end of the world scenario where this argument said that, well, if they cut taxes again, it's going to lead to crowded classrooms, hospitals are going to close, and you're going to be drinking dirty water. And it was almost like an end of the world scenario. And and there's been a lot of comparisons between red versus blue states. And then can you just talk a little bit about that, where those progressive liberals tend to say that you need to have the tax and spend model, otherwise everything else is going to go to hell in the handbasket. Is that true?
No. and in fact, yeah.
Oh, great! I'm glad we can have you here, Vance. That's good.
Yeah. I'm glad to bring my insight.
Yeah.
No, it's not true, and they love to use these apocalyptic sort of references to scare people to not have the tax cuts. Because what do they really want? They want to grow government. They want to have more of an influence in your life and your livelihood. The progressive left does. And the way that they do that is to have more and more taxes. Because if they have more taxes, then they can spend more, they can regulate you more, and it goes back to the bigger burden of all the stuff we talked about earlier. And so they want that to be the case, so that way people will not vote for it and be upset out there in the voters. But the reality is much different. The reality is that whenever you limit spending, cut taxes, cut regulations, is that you promote more economic growth. You give more incentives for people to work, to invest, to get more capital, and have more productivity over time. And what that does is make you more prosperous. I mean, this has happened since, Adam Smith talked about it in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations, where if you allow for people to basically be free and live their life with limited government, then you can have more economic prosperity. And we've seen that in country after country that has done that. And we have seen it in states and even local governments. That's something else that we need to talk about, is local governments also need to make sure that they're keeping their fiscal house in order, because you also see a rise in that of property taxes and other things that get out of control, not because of the property necessarily, but because of the excess spending by local governments.
I think that's an important point. And actually, Vance, that's the point I learned from you when we first started looking into property taxes here, because that's a huge issue here in Iowa. Is I remember, you encouraged me to not look at assessments, but look at government spending as a cause of property taxes, and we've seen that here in Iowa, that there's a lot of times too much focus on assessments and not enough focus on the source of the problem, which is local government spending.
Yes, that's exactly right.
I think that you guys that actually can operate at a high level on this stuff have articulated really well. I'm more of just a political hack that has to try and reduce this to simple terms. But, you talked about Kansas, Vance, and it seems to me, and maybe the way we used to think about tax cuts sometimes at the national level is we are going to cut taxes and starve the beast, and we will figure out the spending part later. Whereas I think what we're seeing, I know we're seeing it in Iowa, and I believe we're seeing around the country, is you start with the spending restraint. And that's what this is all about, is that you start and you build the platform to be able to return those tax dollars back to citizens. And that's where we're at in Iowa. And every time we've done this, I was inside the room in the legislature in 2018 when we passed our first tax reform package like this. And you're not just looking at next year's budget, you're looking 5+ years out in how this works. And that's where I think something like the conservative Iowa budget becomes very useful, is you can look ahead and see that your projected spending and then your projected revenue, that those lines stay where they need to be, so that you don't go negative on it. We're not talking about drastic starving the beast kinds of tax cuts. This is all done out of prudent budgeting. I mean, am I right on that?
Yeah. Okay. No, you're exactly right. I mean, at the federal level in particular, right, because they can run up deficits and they can print money and everything else, there has been this idea that tax cuts are the reason why we have $34 trillion in national debt. Senator, Roanna recently tweeted about this, right, saying that the tax cuts, the last four tax cuts have all been the reason for the $34 trillion in debt. It's nonsense. The tax cuts, I'm not one. I'm not a supply side economist. I should put that out there. I'm a free market economist, and I believe strongly in fiscal sanity on both sides of the equation, the spending and the revenue. When you cut taxes, you do get incentive effects to where there will be more economic growth, but that will not happen overnight. There will be a decline in revenue initially, and then it will come back later on. And so it could pay for itself, but but it'll be longer down the road. But in the short run, you will be running deficits, and that's why, to your point, that spending restraint is so important. You've got to have that first. If you don't have that first, you're going to cause other problems. And deficits matter, and because when they have these deficits, they've got to pay for it through bonds and interest and other things, or print money, which are all just cost to us as well. And at the state level, since they can't run up deficits, it would mean higher taxes if you don't rein in your spending. And so you have a direct cost for those tax cuts, which is the problem that Kansas ran into. And they keep pointing to Kansas as being the problem, or at the federal level, the tax cuts that have happened. But what about the times, to your point, about it, when Governor Reynolds and the legislature there in Iowa reined in spending, and then they were able to cut taxes? There weren't deficits. They didn't have to raise taxes later on. This is a great example of how it can work. Yeah. And the other one, just real quick, is that John and I have wrote about this a lot, is Calvin Coolidge. Harding and Coolidge, the tax cuts during the 1920s were because of spending restraint that provided the roaring 20s.
Absolutely, yeah. That's a great point and a story that needs to be told more. And one thing, too, I think that's where Governor Reynolds has done an excellent job is not just in prudent budgeting, but she has actually reformed government. And so this past session, they passed a major state government reorganization bill, which I actually thought was one of the most important pieces of legislation to come out this session, that begins to streamline government. And, we had 37 executive cabinet agencies. Now it's down to 16. And so it was a major effort on her part to start making government more efficient and sort of reducing bureaucracy and modernizing government. And so, she's actually governing as a fiscal conservative. And that's one of the reasons why the Cato Institute rated her the best in the nation as the most fiscally conservative governor.
Yeah,
we wouldn't trade her for any other governor in the country, Vance.
There you go. I don't think you should either. And I might add to that point, John, which is a great one, is that this sort of idea of the conservative Iowa budget requires some other types of budget reforms, like what she's done. Cutting agencies, that's huge. That's what you want to see. It also allows you to do more like zero-based budgeting, performance-based budgeting, to where you actually can see if these programs are effective. Too often, legislators and governors just take last year's budget and increase it, what I call budget inertia. They just increase it every time without really figuring out, okay, why do we have these programs? So sometimes maybe with every 2, every 3, every 4, some number, you put in a rotation to where, you're going to go over parts of the budget. And when you do that, you can start to weed out those programs that you don't need anymore and figure out, which ones are actually working. I think that's a great way to do it. One other idea I put out there is efficiency audits. What I've been working on has been independent efficiency audits, where you have an independent third party come in, a private entity, and do an audit of some of these programs. You might start with safety net programs like TANF and SNAP and others, just to see how effective they're actually being and where the dollars are actually going, because too often it's going to fraud, waste, and abuse, and oftentimes it's going to other programs that those dollars were never meant to go to. and once you start looking at some of those things, you get your spending under control even more, and you can have more tax cuts in the process, meaning more money in people's pockets, which is ultimately where it should be.
Yeah, I think those are I couldn't agree more. Those are excellent points.
Yeah. Well, very good. John, I know you've been scribbling notes all along, and we had several things we wanted to talk about, but is there anything else that you think we really need to hit on before we? Because I got one last thing that I want to talk to Vance about.
Well, I think we hit the main points of the conservative Iowa budget and just the importance of fiscal conservatism.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, we want to be forward-looking about these things,
Yeah.
and we think that, well, that's what the whole project is about, is the budget being forward-looking towards future tax cut packages. And so I'm wondering, okay, so you got this big new project out with that you've done, and you're doing around the country, but my understanding, Vance, is that you and John have a new project, and it's going to be a little bit more of a federal level thing, is trying to remedy the federal deficit and improve our economy through tariffs and more stringent trade policy. Is that correct?
You got him to laugh again.
So when will we see that piece that extolling the virtues of steel tariffs?
Oh man, it will come from me.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So to be fair to our listeners, I think we got you probably know where John's at, but John and Vance have a very good-natured debate going because they're on opposite sides of this issue. No.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. That's right.
Well,
yeah, we've had a lot of good discussions on tariffs and trade and everything else because it is really important, right? With given the global situation, the threats that come from China, from Russia and others, this is a very important issue to talk about. What are the best ways to go after them? Because I don't think that John necessarily wants to grow government with the tariffs, but whether go, maybe I don't want to put words in his mouth, but find ways to counteract some of the things that their abuses that they're doing in those countries, which I share that concern. My philosophy is just a little bit different to where I think we too often blame other countries for us being less competitive and manufacturing other things when we have one finger pointing at them and three pointing back at ourselves, when we should be cutting taxes and regulations and freeing up the marketplace in America. That will allow us to be more competitive. And if we had more free trade agreements with our allies, and put more pressure on China if they're not in that agreement, which I don't think they should be, then that would actually force, I think, China to change their policies more over time rather than trying to hit them on a lot of tariffs, because ultimately they're a communist country that doesn't really care about their people. They don't have to win re-election. So if you slow down their economy because of the tariff, they're not really going to care. But when you start making it to where they are concerned about other countries not trading with them as well, that's whenever those leaders, basically dictators, will get worried about it. And so that's why I'm more of a free trade agreement sort of guy, like a Milton Friedman approach, compared with others.
Well, and that's good. I appreciate that. My background is more of a free trader. So that I can get along with John, I have to sort of pay lip service to
Sure.
tariffs. No, I'm just kidding. But I have come around a little bit, and I think this is more of maybe a political take on this than a purely economic one. But wherever we're at on that side of the debate, I think we probably need to start with those things that have a direct national security impact, and many of those have to do with our relationship with China. And maybe it's just our ability from a national interest to produce certain raw materials and certain products ourselves, and not being dependent on another country, especially one that isn't necessarily our ally. And so that's kind of where I try to find the middle ground on the issue. Is let's start there, and make sure that that's pro-America. It might not land squarely in the America First policy camp, but it's definitely a pro-America idea. So,
yeah. Mm. Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I know there were some interesting debates for sure. Mine were more with Peter Navarro, who was more aligned. But yeah, I mean, like, and both of y'all are mentioning this. I mean, I think these all come from a good place, and these are the robust debates that we need to be having out there about the path forward. Because, I always go back to Thomas Sowell, one of my favorite economists, that says there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And that's so true. Like, there are trade-offs no matter if you do the tariffs or you do the free trade agreement approach. There are going to be trade-offs. Let's try to limit the trade-offs as much as possible. And by doing so, I think we'll be in a better situation in the future. And I think that's why these robust debates are so important.
Well, I like that. I like that a lot. And I think with a good preview of what the conversation might look like in the future, I think it's probably time to wrap things up for today. But Vance, we really appreciate you being here with us today. This is great. And I know folks are already looking forward to more of this in the future. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And I look forward to being on again sometime soon so we can continue these conversations and find more ways to let people prosper in Iowa. I mean, it's so important what y'all are doing. So keep it going.
All right. Well, thank you very much. All right. That's all the time we got for today. Appreciate you joining us. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share and tell your friends. And with all of that, we will see you next time on ITR Live.